Thank you. I'd like to start by expressing my profound appreciation to John Liviton and to everybody who organized Genocide Awareness Week at Scottsdale Community College, and for all of you who are tuning into Zoom today. Nothing we do in the human rights field is more heart-wrenching, more of an assault on the human spirit than genocide. So I think you're all very, very brave to take this on, and I want to start by acknowledging your courage. The modern approach to genocide grew out of the Nazi atrocities during World War II. Before that, how a country treated people within its borders was considered a matter of national sovereignty, and no foreign country could be engaged. The systemic state-sponsored persecution and mass murder of Jews and others galvanized the world around the notion of preventing genocide and creating an affirmative responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. And that's really what we're doing here this evening. In the aftermath of the war, the liberated prisoners of Buchenwald concentration camp declared, "Never forget." Never forget became the slogan associated with genocides worldwide. Looking back, the rise of the Third Reich has a lot to teach us about how hate created the fertile ground for the rise of Nazism and led to genocide itself. Never forget the leaders of political parties, of houses of worship, of media companies who played upon populist fears of economic displacement, loss of power, and appeals to national pride, and directed their hate toward Jews. Never forget the swell of support for Hitler's vision of a purebred white supremacy, of Aryans ruling over an expanding German empire. Never forget liquidating Jewish-owned businesses. Never forget the Nuremberg laws designating Jews as criminals based not on actions or religion, but on ancestry. Never forget Kristallnacht, when arsonists set flame to synagogues and the fire engines raced to the scene, not saving the houses of worship, but simply assuring the flames didn't spread to neighborhood buildings. Never forget the 1940 establishment of the Warsaw Ghetto, where 460,000 Jews were imprisoned, barely subsisting on meager rations in severely overcrowded rooms. Over 300,000 Jews were murdered by bullets, gas, starvation, and other diseases. Others were sent to death camps. Never forget the courageous uprisings which temporarily halted the deportations. Never forget the 1941 mobile killing units, which murdered 500,000 Jews in the newly occupied Soviet Union. Never forget the final solution, when all Jews were made to wear yellow stars so that they could be easily identified for execution. Never forget 6 extermination camps opened in Belzec, Treblinka, Auschwitz, and war. Never forget when, in 1942, Mengele began experimenting on prisoners in Auschwitz and became known as the Angel of Death. Never forget 1944, when the Nazis tried to hide their atrocities and organized forced death marches from the camps. Never forget Nazi Germany found governments and eager helpers among populations of citizens who collaborated with the Holocaust in every country in Europe. People who built and ran over 44,000 concentration camps, internment camps, ghettos, death sites, and more places to slaughter women, men, and children. Never forget the slaughter of over 1 million, some say up to 5 million, Romas, people with intellectual disabilities, union organizers, social democrats, communists, intellectuals, sexual minorities, Jehovah's Witnesses, and more. Never forget 6 million Jews. Never forget 6 million Jews. Never forget 6 million Jews. In the aftermath of the Nazi atrocities, the nations of the world came together to create the United Nations with three explicit goals: to prevent war, to protect human rights, and to create prosperity. The very first human rights treaty passed by the newly formed General Assembly was the Genocide Convention. It was drafted in order to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and imposed on the governments of the world a responsibility to protect. And yet, think about the litany of genocides and mass killings aimed at particular populations since World War II. Here's an incomplete list. The international community prosecuted crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, and Cambodia. In addition, the International Criminal Court has opened official investigations in Darfur, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic twice, Kenya, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, Georgia, Burundi, Palestine, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. And the ICC is conducting preliminary investigations in Colombia, Guinea, Nigeria, Ukraine, Honduras, South Korea, Iraq, UK, Gabon, the Philippines, Venezuela twice, Cambodia, and registered vessels of Comoros, Greece, and Cambodia. That leaves many places without the official imprimatur of a preliminary investigation, much less accountability, including, for instance, Somalia, Sri Lanka, Yemen, Zanzibar, Biafra, Boko Haram against Fulani herdsmen, Algeria, Guatemala, Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Liberation War, North Korea, Indonesia, East Timor, West Papua, Laos, Argentina, Ethiopia, the Kurds in Iraq, the Marshall Arabs in Iraq, Tibet, Brazil, Zimbabwe, and China's current slaughter of the Uyghurs. This is by no means an exhaustive list. When you think about all that happening, the only way to react is the realization of a massive failure on a global scale. That's why we're here. What are we doing to stop the slaughter? To address this unspeakable horror, the UN created the Office of Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. It advances national and international efforts to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, as well as their incitement. It does through early warnings, assessments, convening, learning, and advocacy. Genocide always shocks us, but it doesn't surprise. Anyone who is paying attention can see it coming. We know the patterns. We know the victims are targets of hate speech, discrimination, and violence. We know that technology companies and social media platforms have an increasing responsibility to stop profiting from the purveyors of hate. Facebook was used to amplify fake stories and foment hate in slaughters in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, just to name a few. Religious leaders and political leaders have a vital role to play, as well as media companies. We must demand that countries protect civic space, the ability of human rights defenders, journalists, and NGOs to organize, participate, and communicate without hindrance, and expand opportunities for human rights defenders to protect targeted populations without fear of reprisal. The worldwide crackdown on the NGOs is one of the most dangerous threats to all of these issues, basic rights. We must assure accountability for atrocities, requiring a system of justice in which everyone has a well-founded faith. We must uphold due process and put an end to impunity. Victims must have access to truth, justice, and reparations. From towns and cities to federal governments, regional systems, and international law, victims must be able to seek justice, and perpetrators must know They will be held to account. All this came home to me 2 years ago when I traveled with a delegation from Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights to investigate abuses perpetrated by the Myanmar army against Rohingya Muslims. Everything we heard from the Rohingya women and men, both in the refugee camps in Bangladesh and the internally displaced persons camps in Rakhine State, Myanmar, as well as all the evidence we saw, pointed to genocide. Nothing we heard from government sources credibly rebutted that overwhelming evidence. We spent 2 days taking testimonies from survivors in the camps in Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp on earth, on the southern tip of Bangladesh. The camp is a spaghetti bowl of narrow alleys dotted with rudimentary shelters precariously clinging to slippery slopes, seemingly ready to slide. Drenched and covered in mud, my 23-year-old daughter, Cara, and I carefully hung our umbrellas on the bamboo rafters outside one of the more stable huts and removed sludge-soaked sneakers and socks. We entered a pristine room, cleared of all furnishings save a few mats, the thatched walls protected from rain by blue tarps stamped made in South Korea. We sat on the floor along with 5 women dressed in burqas, their heads draped in hijabs. 2 were our young Rohingya interpreters, both students aspiring for university degrees, their faces open and bright, their English learned in the camps flawless, a tribute to their thirst for knowledge in a place where most schooling ends after the 5th grade. 3 women, newly arrived to the camps, greeted us warmly, carefully unhitched their veils, and told us about their families, the homes they fled, their lives in the camps. We talked for hours, interrupted only when the monsoon rains pounded the tin roof with such force we could not hear one another. Children peeked through the paneless windows. A curious but shy toddler wrapped himself in the colorful drape that served as a doorway to an adjoining room. When a tray of coffee and biscuits passed through the curtain, he carefully unfurled himself and briefly joined our small circle, emboldened by the lure of a sweet treat. A woman I will call M is 36 years old. She said, quote, "My home is near a security forces outpost. On August 25th, 2017, at 12 p.m., the security forces started shooting. They shot all day and night and finally stopped at 5 a.m. I saw them kill 12 people at the outpost alone. They burned our village, and when people ran from their burning homes, they captured the beautiful women. I knew it was for rape. They didn't rape me, I think, because I speak Rakhine and work as a translator. I knew 2 women taken by the police. When I inquired about the women, I heard that the women were dead." T arrived on August 27th, 2017, into Bangladesh. She said when the military came to her village, they burned all the homes. She saw them rape 3 women. As they left the village, she said, quote, "Security forces just started shooting people. They killed 2 little children who were running away," unquote. Jay arrived to August 29th. She was at home when soldiers burned her village and started shooting her friends. Elsewhere at Cox's Bazar, another woman told us she was raped by many, many, many soldiers. She said she is always in pain and is still bleeding. Then she lifted her dress and showed us the fresh blood from her slip. One after another, women told us of the details of their terror, of watching in horror as soldiers burned their villages, gang raped women, murdered men and boys, raped girls 5, 6, 7 years old, set flames to mosques, rounded up people, and threw their bodies into mass graves. While Cara and I spoke with women, our colleagues from RFK Human Rights spoke with men and heard horrific reports of mass graves, burned villages, children tortured, parents forced to watch soldiers gang rape daughters and wives, a breastfeeding woman's infant torn from her arms and tossed onto the pyre. Each woman told us about their lives, their families, their children, their loved ones raped, murdered, their homes destroyed, their communities burnt to the ground. And then each one talked about what they wanted: to return home, to be finally given the citizenship papers denied them by successive Myanmar regimes, to have good schools for their children and access to healthy food for their families, to be allowed to move freely throughout their country, to enjoy the protection of the police and the respect and friendship of their neighbors. The Rohingya are indigenous to Myanmar and are tied to the land and Rakhine state in a profound way. Bangladesh is not their home. They wish to return to their home as soon as it is safe. The Myanmar government and military can no longer stand behind the absurd lies that they sat across the table and told us. The lie that the Rohingya women and men burned their own villages en masse and decided on their own accord to risk their lives by traveling to Bangladesh. The facts are clear. Starting in early 2017, the Myanmar military deployed soldiers across northern Rakhine state, went door to door, confiscating weapons and sharp objects that might be used as weapons, systematically disarming the Rohingya population. At the same time, the military trained and armed local non-Rohingya ethnic citizens near the Rohingya villages. They tore down fences and barriers around Rohingya homes, giving attackers a better line of sight to facilitate the attacks. And the army limited access to food for Rohingyas, weakening the Rohingya population. These are the actions you take when you are preparing to launch a full-scale slaughter. What happened in August 2017 is shocking, but it's not surprising to the human rights defenders who have been documenting abuses committed by the government of Myanmar across the country and in Rakhine State in particular. This horrific violence is just the latest in a series of attacks building up across the decades. Attacks for which, while perpetrated by the Myanmar army, military, the international community bears a certain responsibility. No one who ever walked through a Holocaust museum can credibly claim to be stunned. The failure to hold the Myanmar military responsible for abuses emboldened them to commit crimes of increasing severity. The international community's failure to hold the Myanmar army accountable in 2017, in my opinion, directly resulted in the slaughter of over 700 street protesters over the past few weeks. The only question before us now is, will we allow the latest round of massive killings to go unpunished once again? Or will we finally stand together in the international community against mass killings in Myanmar? In the last 4 years, thousands have perished. For others, the failure to act now will have grave implications. Myanmar includes well over 100 indigenous ethnic peoples comprising at least 35% of the nation's population. The military has a long history of targeting indigenous peoples with complete impunity and then profiting off of stealing their natural resources, including jade and silver from Kachin, minerals from Shan, and natural gas from Rakhine. License to slaughter one group is license to slaughter others. The failure to hold the perpetrators responsible and place the military under civilian control represents an ongoing threat to tens of thousands of indigenous people of Myanmar and a threat of destabilizing the region. Every border country runs the risk of being compelled to accept tens of thousands of fleeing refugees. Some are fearful of calling the attacks what they are. Let me be clear. This is genocide. This is consistent with the findings of others. On more than one occasion, including to the Human Rights Council, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights invoked the crime of genocide with regard to the 2017 attacks against the Rohingya. UN Special Rapporteur Yang-hee Lee said the situation bears the hallmarks of genocide. Pramila Patten, UN Special Rapporteur on Sexual Violence, likened the Army's systemic rape of women to genocide. Today, I hope everyone at this conference will join Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights in calling for international justice. It's well past time to argue over the terms ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities, or genocide, as if one label leads to action and a lesser one means we can somehow evade responsibility. It's not hard to see that the authorities have demonstrated an intent to kill or exile the Rohingya, and it's still happening today. Let's investigate, prosecute, and finally hold the rapists and the butchers accountable. From Germany to Cambodia, from Bosnia to Rwanda, again and again, we have learned the same lesson. Until there's accountability, the risk of repeated attacks of increasing severity is not just likely, it's guaranteed. There are at least 900,000 Rohingya refugees in camps in Bangladesh and thousands more in IDP camps in Myanmar. Many more Rohingya live in extreme vulnerability scattered throughout Rakhine State and across Myanmar, wondering when their homes will be burned and worse. We will not rest until every single person is able to return to their homes in safety and security, and until they are finally able to lay claim to the citizenship that Myanmar has systemically denied them ever since 1982. This will not be an easy task. Countries of conscience will have to pressure China, who is playing a destructive role in Myanmar. ASEAN countries will have to abandon their failed policy of non-interference. The United States and other governments must apply targeted sanctions to those who committed gross violations of human rights and international crimes. The United Nations Security Council must refer cases of genocide and crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. And for the Rohingya to safely return to their homes, Myanmar will have to amend the law to provide full citizenship to this distinct and indigenous ethnic group. The scale and viciousness of the attacks against the Rohingya requires a commensurate international response. The Myanmar military calculated that they could get away with perpetrating a genocide with little to no consequences. It's our job, all of us, to show them they were wrong. What happened to the Rohingya was fueled by hate. Indeed, when I look around the world, I think that the biggest threat we face as a planet is hatred. If you look back at the headlines over the last 5 years, it seems as though the world has become unmoored, nearly all of it by a single overarching evil. Hate is the one common denominator tying together the rise of ISIS from Syria to Iraq to Paris, Brussels and Nice, the kidnapping of girls by Boko Haram in Nigeria and Mali, the attacks by China on the Uyghurs in Xinjiang and by Myanmar on the Rohingya. As a result of misogyny, Saudi Arabia has lost the productivity of fully half its population. And femicide, the killing of women because they are women, is on the rise throughout Central America. In Guatemala, over the last 30 years, only 3% of the cases of murder of women have gone to trial, and far fewer have ended with a conviction. 97% of the time, when a woman is killed, literally nothing happens, nothing at all. And this is before we even touch on the Trump administration and all that president did to increase hate against Muslims, Mexicans, Africans, women, Blacks, Indians, immigrants, and so many, many more. In May 2020, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, quote, "The pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering, and urged governments to act now to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate." Nearly 1 year on, communities worldwide say the situation hasn't improved, with many countries reporting spikes in hate crimes. For many, the pandemic has only amplified long-standing and violent racism towards Asian people. UK police data suggests a rise of 300% in hate crimes toward Chinese, East and South Asian in the first quarter of 2020. Anti-Semitism is on the rise across Europe, with common conspiracy theories blaming Jews for the COVID epidemic and white supremacists, emboldened by the Trump presidency, recruiting haters around the globe. Anti-Semitism in Hungary has been sanctioned by the government in any number of ways. For instance, Budapest Memorial for the Victims of the German Occupation relativizes Hungary's deportation of more than 440,000 Jews during the Holocaust. And anti-Semitic writers such as Albert Wass, who was sentenced in absentia for death for war crimes in 1946, are now part of the national curriculum. This problem is far from isolated. While 13% of Hungarian Jews in a 2018 study worried about becoming the victim of the anti-Semitic physical attack, by comparison, 47% of Jews living in Germany feared attacks, while in France, the number is a whopping 58% of Jews fear physical attacks. And here at home, hate is unmistakably on the rise. Even the Trump Department of Homeland Security identified white nationalist extremists as the deadliest domestic terror threat in our country. The extremists are bolstered by reactionary zealots in state legislatures around the United States, still stinging from November losses, who are moving to aggressively restrict freedom to vote in 43 states. Make no mistake, this is all about white supremacy and the fear that Blacks, Latinos, Asians, and immigrants will be getting the vote. More than 250 bills introduced in recent months target communities of color, young people, and the poor by restricting voting hours and the availability of absentee ballots and creating stricter ID requirements, among other obstacles. In Georgia, a common courtesy such as offering a voter waiting in a long line a drink of water is now a misdemeanor charge. President Biden, in his inaugural address, spoke of the, quote, "rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat." To overcome these challenges, to restore the soul and secure the future of America will require so much more than words. It requires the most elusive of all things in a democracy, unity, unquote. As students and scholars, you are well aware of the problem. And you know the percentage of the population feeling marginalized, hopeless, angry, and seduced by hate is too large to ignore. The great challenge for all of us is not going to be how do we run a country despite all that hate, but how do we bring the people who feel dispossessed and angry at government back into the fold? How do we make them feel that they have a stake in democracy and a place at the table while addressing the hate and the policy implications for that hate head on? I advocate for 3 parts of this. 1, reach out to the disaffected and try to understand the reasons for their rage. Pope Francis called for additional beatitudes, including "blessed are those who look into the eyes of the abandoned and marginalized and show them closeness." Set a tone as leaders, not of anger and rage, the cheap and easy way to get elected, but appeal, as President Lincoln said, to the better angels of our nature. Meet hate with love. to address the institutional injustices within our power, economic dislocation, a broken criminal justice system, prosecute domestic violence, hold the rich and powerful accountable for their part in misery. Be sure schools teach and hospitals heal. And 3, teach the next generation to stand up to the bullies from the playground to the presidential palace. For the past 20 years, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights has been teaching students from kindergarten to law school about human rights and showing them how they can make a difference. We teach about human rights, through human rights, for human rights. Let me give you one example. We have a curriculum for 12-year-olds who are learning language arts. So that's about 8th grade. The first assignment is about poetry. We give the students 2 or 3 lesson plans, 2 or 3 articles about conditions facing children who manufacture chocolate. About 70% of the chocolate consumed in the United States is made by children in slavery or child labor. The students learn about those children and write poems in iambic pentameter. They are from the perspective of the kids in child labor. Each poem is called Dear Bobby, and they're written to Robert F. Kennedy. The students learn about text analysis, compassion, and poetry. The next assignment is expository writing. And again, we hand back those students the articles on the manufacture of child labor, and we give them also the name and addresses of the CEOs of Godiva and Hershey's and Mars. And the kids then have to write a letter explaining the problem and demanding a solution. So again, they're learning text analysis. They're doing social emotional learning, taking something that was expressed from an emotional perspective in poetry and into a well-reasoned, fact-based argument. And they're learning the skill set of writing a business letter. Where does the return address go? Where does the real address go? Where does the stamp go? And then finally, the third assignment comes around mid-October, and we give the kids 4x6 index cards. And on one side, they write a few sentences about the problem. And then they say there's a solution, and it's fair trade chocolate. And then they scotch tape a piece of fair trade chocolate to the cards. And then they do, on Halloween, they do reverse trick or treat. So whenever somebody gives them a piece of chocolate, they say, thank you so much, and they hand back the cards. At the end of the assignment, and through class discussion, the kids self-identify as human rights defenders. The point of the exercise is not only to address the child labor in cocoa fields, but the much more revolutionary thing that we are doing is changing the way the students see themselves when they look into the mirror. Suddenly they see themselves as human rights defenders. And teachers report that something else happens too. The incidence of bullying goes down in the classroom because human rights defenders don't take part in bullying. The number one reason for truancy is bullying. So when bullying goes down and kids come to school, and when kids start coming to school, their grade point average goes up. So this is not an anti-bullying program per se. The real point is to empower kids, especially those kids who feel that they're being judged solely by their test scores and that they will never do well on those tests. We are saying you are valuable just as you are. Just as you are, just as you show up. You have something to contribute. You can create a better world, a more just and peaceful world. And we are going to work with you to show you how you can do it. I started working in human rights in the early 1980s. I was a sophomore in college, and I was an intern at Amnesty International in Washington, D.C. I was assigned the task of documenting abuses committed by U.S. immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador. Beyond my particular assignment, I learned about refuseniks in Russia, anti-apartheid activists in South Africa, the mothers of the disappeared in Chile. The cause was compelling. The enemy was dangerous and powerful. But I found myself surrounded by Davids who, with little more than the slingshots of their heart and nerve and sinew to support them, stood up against a world full of Goliaths. Looking back, it seems like the angels prevailed. At the time, military dictatorships ruled across Latin America. Today, there are no right-wing military dictatorships left. Communism dominated Eastern Europe. Today, there's not a communist government in Eastern Europe. South Africa suffered under the agony of apartheid. Today, South Africa has had a series of freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. And CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, and women's rights wasn't even on the international agenda. It really wasn't until the Women's Rights Convention in Beijing, where Hillary Clinton famously said women's rights are human rights, which was revolutionary at the time, that women's rights came to be on the international agenda. And now CEDAW, the Women's Rights Convention, has been ratified by 189 nations. All these changes came about not because governments wanted them to, governments tried to stop them. And not because militaries wanted them to, huge militaries tried to stop them. And not because powerful multinational corporations wanted them to, corporations tried to stop them. They came about because small groups of determined people harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true. And that created a ripple effect, encouraging others, building a tidal wave which swept down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Margaret Mead said, "Don't ever underestimate the capacity of a small group of determined people to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." When my father, Bobby Kennedy, went to South Africa in 1966, he spoke about moral courage. He said moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one vital quality for those who seek to change a world which yields most painfully to change. And those with the courage to enter the moral conflict will find themselves with companions in every corner of the globe. I want to thank you, John, and thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight and for joining us in companions in the struggle for justice and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I really appreciate that. That was excellent. We learned a lot from that. There are a couple of questions, and as people put them in chat now and come up with them, I think I'll just come out with them and ask you as though we're having a conversation. So,
okay.
In light of the coup that's just happened in Myanmar and the subsequent violence and murders and killings, what is happening to the Rohingya now?
Well, most of the Rohingya, the vast majority of Rohingya they're not in Myanmar. They either got slaughtered or they became refugees, and they're in Cox's Bazar refugee camp in Bangladesh. So that's got about 900,000 to 1 million. There are a few 100,000 left in Myanmar. A lot of them in the IDP camps, which are concentration camps. They're not allowed to leave. They have a very restricted life and little to no ability to have communications with the outside world. Then there are a few people who are scattered across the country who are living in homes, and it's an extremely dangerous time for them. I just actually had a conversation with one of the leaders just a few hours ago, and as he said, the failure to hold the army accountable for the slaughter of the Rohingya in 2017 is what's led to the killings more recently.
Okay. We have a question from Kim Klett, and she says, you mentioned some things we can do to help the Rohingya, such as sanctions. What actions could our students take? Do letters to elected officials help?
Absolutely. You think those letters don't help, they really help. They make a big difference. So absolutely get in touch with your elected leaders and demand that the United States step up to, there's a bunch of things that we can do. So targeted sanctions, you don't want economic sanctions, because economic sanctions harm everybody in the country and do very little to actually the perpetrators wealthy enough to not really care. But you can do targeted sanctions. So you can say, you can restrict the ability to travel to the United States or Europe to the perpetrators of the violence. Some people advocate doing that for their families as well, which makes them unable to go to school outside of Myanmar, that sort of thing. They can't go on vacation, they can't leave the country, basically. That is one thing that we've called for. I think at this point, there's a lot of consideration, it's controversial, but of asking the UN to send forces in, which of course is what stopped the slaughter in East Timor and in other places. So that's considered as well. And the main thing is accountability, making sure that people don't feel that they can get away with this type of massive human rights violations without being held accountable.
So what's the reasoning, do you think, that the Islamic countries, you've got Saudi Arabia, Indonesia obviously does not want the Rohingya to come into their country. They've been turning the boats away and such. So why haven't Islamic nations, Muslim nations, said something?
Yeah, it's interesting. So what can so first of all, Bangladesh, for all of its problems, poverty, and massive human rights violations committed there, has been incredibly generous and has opened up those lines and allowed all the refugees to come in. The conditions in the refugee camps are abysmal, but at least they're in Bangladesh. So we have to really acknowledge what Bangladesh has done there. Other Muslim countries have sent funding, but not on the scale that needs to be sent. And then European countries, as one person and one of the officials in Bangladesh said to me, do you think Europe at this point has any taste at all to take in Muslim refugees? No way. So then that comes back to the hatred. We need to address the anti-Muslim hatred in our country and across Europe as well.
Okay. We have a question from Devin Dawson, who says, what are the implications that Myanmar's coup has on the neighboring countries, such as Bangladesh and others,
Well, as I was saying, it's very, very destabilizing for the entire region. So Myanmar is, this is a real simplification, but it's basically, imagine it's kind of like a clock. So the people in the middle are Burmese. That's their ethnicity. That's their background. They're Burmese. And Aung San Suu Kyi and the army are Burmese. And then all around the outside perimeter are these indigenous groups. And the indigenous groups control all of the natural resources. So one has jade and one has gas and another has diamonds and emeralds and other things. So the history of that country is that the Burmese control the army and control the wealth. And they have gone into the ethnic areas, raided them, enslaved local people, and stolen the natural resources and used that to enhance their own wealth. So that is what happened with the Rohingya. All the other ethnic groups have had, or a lot of the other ethnic groups have had similar types of incursions into their territory, and they're seeing that. And they're very, very concerned. So all of the countries that border on Myanmar are also concerned about large numbers of refugees coming into their country.
Okay, so Aung Suu Kyi, apparently she had some plans to start resorts up in the area where the Rohingya lived, up in northwestern Myanmar, and I imagine have been put on hold because of the coup. But do you think that in the future that the Myanmar government will carry on to try to do those sorts of programs?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, the interesting thing about Aung San Suu Kyi is she is a proponent of democracy for the Burmese, but for the Burmese, for the people in the center of the clock, you know, not for everybody. So for the international community was taken because she's so forceful about believing in democracy and talking about the importance of Burma. But so that was a surprise to the international community when she seemed to defend the army's genocide against the Rohingya. But for people who are in Burma, they weren't surprised at all because what the army did was consistent with Burmese nationalism. So, yeah, I'm not surprised by that.
Okay. And you're a very devout Catholic, and so when how do Buddhists reconcile from their devoutness? How do they reconcile what this Buddhist country with, is doing to the Rohingya? I mean, it's
Well,
not very Buddhist.
this is the nature of hate, right? So, we had all those good Christians in Germany, and we had lots of Christians and Jews and Muslims in the former Yugoslavia who are very, very devout and real believers. And when the church the leaders in the places of worship demonize a group of people and say this is the reason for our pain or our economic isolation or the reason that your kid isn't going to a good enough school or didn't get better in the hospital, or the reason you can't get ahead is because of this group. That's what happens, and that's exactly what was happening to the Rohingya.
Okay. Okay, here's another call for questions. Does anyone else have a question?
See, if you talk long enough, people don't. You exhaust them.
Okay. So, well, I've heard there are comments here about you being very inspirational, which you are. And thank you very much for your presentation and your thoughts and your experience.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask, apparently Hava's come on now. Hava, do you have a question?
No, my question was actually about Aung San Suu Kyi, whose behavior could have been a lot more forceful, and you explain why she did not take a more. I would expect her to do more for a Nobel Prize winner in peace, she should have done much more to stop.
Yeah, well, I'm with you. I mean, don't forget that Henry Kissinger also won the Nobel Peace Prize. So there's plenty of people out there who won that prize who won it for one thing that they did at one moment in their life, but who have not, I mean,
That's true.
there are few people who are responsible for more slaughter than Henry Kissinger. So let's, the Nobel Committee, sometimes it's for lifetime achievement and sometimes it's not. But Aung San Suu Kyi, again, as I said, I think people in the West really just didn't understand who she was. And when she was talking about the importance of democracy for Burma, they thought that meant Burma because they thought the country is called Burma, but she was talking about the Burmese. She was not talking about everybody in the country.
Hmm.
So,
That's a very important point.
yeah, we would like her to do more, but don't count on it.
Okay, it's a very important point. Well, thank you very much, Kerry. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing more about what Robert, the RFK human rights is doing, is accomplishing. A couple of weeks ago, a month ago, maybe, I heard you on the 100 Women to Listen to and was very impressed with what you've been doing. By the way, that is out there if you want to listen to it. And so it's, thank you very, very much. And I really appreciate it. And
Well,
now,
thanks, John. I just want to leave on one note. Most states in the United States are really either blue or red, and they're really divided. But you guys are in Arizona. And so what you do about this issue, in a way, counts more than what people in solid other states do. So I just really want the students who are part of this to hear what a difference you can make. What your voice means in the national debate is really, really vitally important. And you're coming out and voting on the issues that you care about. If you care about genocide, if you care about human rights and peace and justice, we need you to get out there, organize, get your friends, get your family, and get involved. Thank you.
thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care, John.
Okay. I'm going to stop the recording now. And we